Part three is all about how do we shift a rooted system. In part two, we talked about, the risk of collapse and reorganization. As long as you hold this perspective, we saw this in 2008 when the financial system tried to collapse. One of our first reactions was to put energy back into those old systems. And again, it makes sense because a lot of people depended on those systems. But in that disruption, that's where we saw, for example, the movement of the electric car come in, and we saw new forms of banking come in that were actually more biomimetic, locally attuned banking systems and credit systems. So disruption is a good thing. It allows evolution and innovation. And the longer one view is held beyond its time, that's where we see the sharper and more extreme surprise, the perception of complexity, and the resulting adjustment. So the key to resiliency, especially ecological resiliency, is to let things change, let things evolve, and that also includes our mindset. So this is a model of ecological resilience. It's called the adaptive cycle. And there's four kind of processes in this, four phases. I think this is a really powerful model for helping us understand how do we shift a rooted system. We can look to nature. So the front loop, which is about exploitation down at the bottom left, to conservation. That's like, think of any ecosystem that emerges from a volcano, from a forest fire, whatever it is, a desert. If you let nature be long enough, there's going to be this ecological succession where first you have the pioneer species come in and they, break up kind of the complex rocks and the foundation. They exploit the natural resources, which are in abundance, like solar. And they also live and die quickly so that they're creating a biomass for deeper rooted species to emerge. And over time, that ecological succession moves from an exploitation phase to conservation phase. We're going to see more complex ecosystems, more diversity. That's that first phase, like I said, exploitation to conservation. But this is where we kind of differ from the rest of the natural world. In conservation, there's an important release to allow reorganization. We're seeing in Canada constant forest fires. And these forest fires, there's a hypothesis that a lot of it is because we've been mismanaging forests and we've had a reductionist kind of perspective on forest fires over centuries. Whereas indigenous practices actually encourage forest fires. It was a part of their regenerative strategy. So a forest fire is an example of a release to allow reorganization. That forest, all those stored materials are being released back into the ecosystem for some new system to emerge, allowing new species to exploit those resources. And it can happen at multiple scales. You can have a forest fire to allow reorganization, or you can think of in the autumn when leaves fall. That is a form of reorganization, a release and reorganization, because that the materials are going back into the soil. And that means that new organisms that might be more attuned and more appropriate for those conditions can emerge. To give you an example, think of a willow tree, which is a water-loving species living by a river. And what if that river were to dry up? Well, those willows would inevitably die, releasing materials back into the system, allowing new species to emerge, perhaps more drought-resistant species. So the release and reorganization is an evolutionary strategy to help new systems be locally attuned. And like I said, these releases happen at multiple scales. So I'm not saying we need to destroy our cities and start from scratch. But what are some small scale ways that we could kind of release our thinking? Maybe it's just a window. Like, what if a window could be innovated by using biomimicry and new ecological principles? What if a window could be made with benign chemistry? Or maybe a window could take inspiration from an octopus eye. Who knows? The way that we can encourage resiliency by copying nature is start at the small scale. Don't wait for those big collapses to happen. Or if those big collapses do happen, use them as opportunities not to rebuild the same thing that was just collapsed, but build something with a new paradigm, with a new strategy, a new way of thinking. Because we're already seeing these forest fires happening. This is in Maui last year. We're seeing these massive environmental disasters that are forcing us to rethink the way that we do things. And this is where biomimicry is so powerful and important, is that in those releases is our chance to adopt a new mindset or a paradigm that could be more regenerative, that could be more in line and harmonized with nature. And one of the ways I do this with clients is that I encourage them to use this adaptive cycle as a model. So instead of waiting for disasters, I encourage them to think of what's their large-scale design fiction What do they see in the future? What do they want to have happen in the future? And embed nature's principles into that. What's that next state of conservation, that next ecosystems that we want to create? And design fiction is, by definition, it's the development of believable ideas that might not yet be possible, but that provoke a conversation of what could be or should be possible. So with clients, we use this design fiction to get them to step outside of their preconceptions, to playfully think about what is it that they want to build for their future generations? What do they want to create for their great grandchildren? And not worry so much about building codes and standards, but just like what's the general vibe of that system that they want to create. And that's our chance to integrate principles from nature. Like what if we had buildings that could breathe like skin, or that could breathe like lungs? What if our buildings were connected in their underground networks, sharing resources with each other? That's when we can embed these bold ideas to provoke a conversation. And we've done this with clients, thinking about how we could rethink lighting. We think of hospitals and the importance of light and healing. How do we bring light further into the floor plates? And polar bear hair is a great example. Polar bear hair is translucent and it pulls that light energy into the black skin. Polar bears are actually black skinned. So imagine bringing fiber optic cables and pulling light deeper into a building. This is an example of design fiction. It's not totally doable, but it provokes a conversation of what could be or should be possible. And it's not far off. There's technologies that we can exploit to make these ideas real. I want to kind of pause there for a second too and recognize that one of the key barriers I see to biomimicry is a lack of creativity. What I mean by that is a lack of creativity in how we abstract ideas from nature, and also lack of creativity in how we can exploit current technologies. Biomimicry doesn't have to be expensive. It doesn't have to be prohibitive. If you work together, bring those diversities of perspectives together, you're going to have really powerful insights coming from new ideas. And the key is not to think about one idea being right and one idea being wrong. Again, that's your bias kind of inserting itself on other people's biases. We all have a bias. So how do we put them into this melding pot to allow them to kind of creatively reimagine the way things are done? And a good example of this is Ray Anderson of Interface Carpets. I shared a video in our extra data or our extra materials that highlights how Ray Anderson took a design fiction approach to improving his carpet manufacturing company. He set out a goal for 25 years, and then he took small steps to get there. So he had his design fiction approach, and then he made incremental stages, releasing at small scale to get to his Mount Sustainability, he called it. And he was successful in doing so. And not only did he change his company, he actually changed the entire carpet industry by doing this approach. So I kind of implied there that there's two stages. So one, create your design fiction for shifting a system, but then come back to what's possible today. And what I like to encourage students to do is think like a weed. And what I mean by that is a weed, doesn't see barriers, it sees opportunities. A crack in a pavement is an opportunity to a weed. So where there are unused opportunities for exploiting kind of design ideas or exploiting opportunities to get you to that design fiction. We don't know how we're going to get there. We just have a vision of what we want, and we're going to take these incremental steps to potentially get there. And again, an example from my students is the students wanted to dissipate storm events, recognizing that combined sewer overflow was a major problem in Toronto. So the design fiction was, how do you slow down water like a canopy of a forest? That was the design fiction. And the small scale integration, thinking like a weed, the student was walking downtown and he saw the rain kind of penetrating the side of the building. And he thought, what if we could slow that water down too, not just capture it on top, but slow it down? And so he made these modular kind of rain catchment systems that were able to absorb water. He leveraged existing technology to make these sponge-like effects to hold it and actually use it in the building, but also slow down the water so that the combined sewers were not overwhelmed with during a rain event. Because the combined sewers would get overwhelmed, they would bypass the treatment system, and they'd pollute the waters that we swam in and that we drank from. Here's 6 principles for shifting a system. I kind of mentioned some of them throughout this process, but encourage self-organization, local interactions at small scale, encourage a culture of experimentation and small scale release, To do biomimicry, you don't have to think about starting over from scratch, but what's that small thing you could bring into a building or into a road or into a design process that could make us think differently? Avoid short-term thinking and conservation. Don't try and fight nature or don't try and keep things the same. Acknowledge biases and embrace creativity, heterogeneity, and uncertainty. Incorporate multiple layers of frequency of feedback, and leverage existing assets and reconfigure them in completely new ways. One of my favorite examples of that last point is Airbnb and Uber. They saw wasted opportunities in underused homes and underused cars. Just like a weed, they're thinking like a weed, and they made a simple app to exploit those opportunities. And in doing so, they completely disrupted the hotel or the hospitality and transportation industries, leading to this design fiction of, now hospitality is very different than it was 25 years ago. So this is the way we want to encourage people to think biomimetically, is think like a weed. Have your design fiction, but also figure out ways you can exploit and reconfigure existing opportunities. Thank you so much for participating in the second video. There's a lot to unpack there, and we've given you access to more materials if you want to keep diving deeper. But the key thing I want to recognize is that nature is this brilliant set of solutions that exist for our opportunity to learn from. And I like this quote from Janine Benyus that says, as we go on this journey of creating a regenerative and catalyzing a regenerative future, we have to recognize ourselves not as a bad species, but just a very young one. Thank you very much.